Right, it's 5:30. I think we should just go ahead. So welcome to another lecture sponsored by the Center for Historic Preservation at University of Mary Washington. My name is Christina Turdin. I teach museum studies in the Department of Historic Preservation. And I also serve as the director of the Center for Historic Preservation. For those of you who do not know what the center does, it has the noble mission of linking the students and the faculty in the department with the preservation community at local, regional, and national levels through talks like this one, through workshops, through grant proposals and research projects. So welcome to our series of lectures. The talk today is titled Evidence of Dental Intervention from a Late Woodland Burial in Virginia. We have three distinguished speakers, and I would like to introduce them to you. Kerry Gonzalez is a lab manager and project archaeologist with Dovetail Cultural Resource Group here in town. In this capacity, she manages the laboratory and assures quality control over processes including artifact identification and analysis, coordinating with project managers on deadlines, and preparing collections for final curation. As project archaeologist, she directs projects ranging from phase 1 surveys to phase 3 on a variety of sites. Kerry is the chair of the Society for Historical Archaeology Curation and Collections Management Committee, as well as a member of the Archaeological Collections Consortium. Joe Blondino is field director in archaeology, also with Dovetail. His experience ranges from survey and site identification to data recovery excavation on archaeological sites in Virginia, North Carolina, New Jersey, Maryland, Delaware, and Eastern Pennsylvania. His primary academic training is in archaeology, but he has extensive training in geology, geomorphology, and soil science. The third speaker is Joanna Wilson-Green, and she is the Easement and Stewardship Archaeologist with Virginia Department of Historic Resources in Richmond. She is the primary staff archaeologist for the department's Conservation Easement program and also provides technical assistance to other agency divisions with regard to archaeological site identification, evaluation, and treatment. She serves as the department's point of contact for all issues involving cemeteries and human remains. Her academic training focused on physical anthropology, and she has worked with cemeteries and burial populations in Wyoming, Tennessee, West Virginia, Virginia, Ohio, and North Carolina. Thank you for joining us for this talk. I will ask the attendees to please write their questions in the chat box at the bottom of their screens. We will continue with the Q&A section at the end of the lecture. So please go ahead with your presentation.
Okay, thank you, Christina, and thank you everyone who logged on tonight. Before I begin, there are a few things I would like to mention up front. First, this presentation does contain images of human remains. If anyone in the audience would rather not see this type of image, I would wait to the second half of the presentation. Second, we have worked closely with the Nansemond tribe throughout this project and are grateful for the tribe's permission to show these images, as well as permission to perform destructive analysis on the remains. If anyone has any questions or concerns pertaining to this aspect of the project, please feel free to touch base with Joanna Wilson-Green, archaeologist with the DHR and co-author on this paper. Third, the results from this study would never have been possible if it wasn't for the team approach taken at the very beginning. This is something I would like everyone to keep in mind throughout this presentation, as it can be a misconception that archaeologists know everything about the past. This project is a prime example of how it is imperative that we lean on and include colleagues for research projects. To give everyone a little background, Dovetail Cultural Resource Group, a local cultural resource management firm, was contacted by the Virginia Department of Historic Resources in the spring of 2018 to excavate a set of human remains exposed during a construction project in the southern Chesapeake region of Virginia. Although the burial was disturbed by construction activities as well as plowing during the historic period, a flexed burial, and that's one where the legs are bent or crouched and folded up to the chest position, was apparent, indicating that the remains were likely Native American. Through consultation with the DHR, an approximate 3,000 square foot area surrounding the burial was mechanically exposed to identify additional interments or other archaeological features. It was during this work that a second flexed burial was discovered and excavated. In addition to the two burials, other areas of archaeological interest were observed, specifically the remains of a possible structure which presented as circular stains in the ground and represent the locations of decomposed structural posts. And we've provided a little example here of what a structural post looks like archaeologically. It's a circular stain in the ground, and this here is one after it's been excavated. 184 artifacts were recovered during the fieldwork, none of which were recovered from the burials themselves. The majority of the artifacts were what we refer to as prehistoric pottery. Many of these sherds were decorated through stamping or incising of the wet clay prior to it being fired. This is something important to note because it helps archaeologists date this type of artifact. Preliminary analysis of the pottery indicated that many of the vessels were jars with straight walls, such as the one shown right here. This one right here.
Okay, I'd like to just hope everyone understands that ordinarily archaeologists avoid showing images of human remains of any age or origin, and this is out of respect for the individuals themselves. In this case, we have the permission of the Nansemond tribe to briefly show these images in order to illustrate the extraordinary nature of this discovery and the research that followed. So we ask that you view the physical remains of these unknown individuals with respect, because they have been our teachers throughout this process, and we are deeply grateful to them. The first burial, burial 1, excavated, was oval in shape and contained the skeletal remains of a single individual. Even though this burial was not completely intact due to the previously mentioned construction activities, enough of the original placement of the burial was discernible to determine that the individual was in a flexed position on their left side, with the hands at or beneath the mandible and the knees drawn up to the torso. Although the remains were fragmentary, analysis found features consistent with a female, including small mastoid processes, a rounded chin, and delicate vertebrae. Age at death was estimated between 18 and 25 years, and the innominate bone indicates evidence of childbirth. 16 teeth were recovered with the right mandible and associated teeth in situ. All exhibited light to moderate wear with some dentin exposure. The single maxillary incisor recovered exhibits the remnants of shoveling, although edge wear has reduced its expression. The maxillary first molar exhibited one carious lesion on the occlusal surface, and the mandibular right second premolar and all mandibular right molars were lost before death, and the surrounding alveolus exhibited significant remodeling indicating loss prior to death. The second burial, or burial 2, was also ovate in shape and was relatively intact despite being repeatedly plowed over during the historic period. Analysis of the human remains from burial 2 confirmed a discrete burial containing the skeletal remains of a single individual. As with burial 1, this burial was in a tightly flexed position, but interred on the right side, with hands at or beneath the mandible and knees drawn up to the torso. Due to years of plowing activities, only a portion of the left side of the skeletal remains were present. Analysis identified features consistent with a male, including pronounced brow ridges, a squared chin, robust mastoid processes, robust long bones with large humeral and femoral heads, and a narrow sciatic notch. Age at death was estimated at 35 years or older. 15 teeth were recovered with much of the right and anterior mandible intact and teeth in situ. In general, there was moderate to heavy occlusal wear with significant dentin exposure. Deep carious lesions were present on the occlusal surfaces of the mandibular left second and third molars, the maxillary right third molar, and the enamel junction of the maxillary right premolar. High-resolution cone beam computed tomography showed a pulp exposure of the maxillary right first molar due to attrition. The mandibular right third molar was missing antemortem, And what this translates to is that they were eating a very gritty diet, which wore down their teeth. Several weeks after the completion of Dovetail's field work, DHR personnel were contacted by detectives with the city police who reported that a local citizen had spotted human remains eroding from a riverbank below the location of the original discovery. At the request of local law enforcement and with the permission of the Nansemond tribe, DHR archaeologists recovered the partial remains of a minimum of 3 individuals. All appeared to have been interred together in one ossuary feature. Although most of the feature had been lost to erosion, what remained was the bottom of an oval pit measuring approximately 60 centimeters at the base. Feature fill contained large quantity of oyster shell, which likely directly contributed to excellent bone preservation. Preliminary dating of the ossuary indicates that it was contemporaneous with burials 1 and 2. The most intact of the ossuary burials was found interred face up, with arms folded and knees drawn to the torso. Analysis of this individual identified features consistent with a female, including small mastoid processes, a smooth brow, rounded calvarium, and delicate long bones. Incomplete fusion of the iliac crest and a fully erupted but unworn maxillary third molar indicates an age of death of approximately 18 to 21 years. Tooth wear was otherwise mild to moderate, with a large carious lesion on the buccal surface of the maxillary right first molar and a pinpoint lesion on the occlusal surface of the maxillary right second molar. A minimum of 2 additional individuals were present as well. One exhibited characteristics consistent with an age at death of 10 to 16 years and is likely female. Tooth wear is very light with only minimal flattening of molar cusp and no caries are present. The third individual, represented by the fewest identifiable elements, exhibits characteristics consistent with an age at death of 21 to 25 years based on epiphyseal fusion and is likely male based on the robust nature of associated long bones. Mandibular fragments and teeth exhibit moderate wear and include a large carious lesion on the lingual surface of the right front molar and a large lesion on the buccal surface of the left second molar.
Okay. So now that we have provided the background of our findings, we would now like to discuss one of the aforementioned carious lesions from burial 2. The mandibular left second molar of this individual showed evidence of what the authors have found to be therapeutic dental intervention. This specimen displayed a large circular carious lesion with circular striations on the interior walls and floor. Due to this apparent anomaly, a local dentist, Dr. Jazrael Cruz, was consulted. Based on his initial interpretation that the decayed tissue within the carious lesion had been intentionally removed, and in consultation with the DHR and the Nansemond tribe, a research team was formed to determine if this carious lesion was in fact evidence of early dental intervention or the result of natural formation. We first contacted Dr. Martin Levin, who is also currently aiding in the analysis of archaeological remains from Jamestown. Through our contact with Dr. Levin, many more experts ranging from bioarchaeologists to Kerryologists were consulted on this project. In addition to the potential intervention on the carious lesion, Dr. Levin also documented the extraction of the mandibular right third molar and extrusion of the opposing maxillary right third molar. Now, what all this means is the wisdom tooth that was here was pulled, and there was nothing here to stop this tooth from migrating down. So that's what it means by the extrusion. High-resolution cone beam computed tomography confirmed that this individual underwent extraction of his third molar. Dr. Tonis, a local periodontist, concurred that the individual represented in burial 2 had his mandibular right third molar, his wisdom tooth, and I quote, traumatically extracted, as evidenced by the healed extraction socket. This extraction likely occurred 2 to 5 years before death, as evidenced by a healed extraction socket. This extraction likely occurred 2 to 5 years before death, according to Dr. Tonis. The reason or the exact method for the extraction is unknown, but the general lack of periodontal disease, which can cause teeth to loosen due to the loss of supporting bone, shows that this tooth was pulled as opposed to falling out. This extraction suggests that not only did this individual suffer from poor dental health, but also that he likely resided with or near a person experienced in or at least willing to perform dental treatment. Extensive analysis completed on the molars from burial 2 indicate that not only did this individual have a tooth extracted, but he also was subjected to therapeutic dental intervention, as evidenced by the large carious lesion in the mandibular left second molar. In an effort to document potential intervention on this tooth, we first examined the molar under a Hyrox microscope, courtesy of the College of William and Mary. While no definitive striations representing possible tool marks were observed at this point, the results were nonetheless encouraging enough for us to pursue additional examination at a higher magnification. Through the use of a scanning electron microscope and several micro CT scans of the specimen, we observed clearly defined circumferential striations on the interior of the carious lesion. It is currently hypothesized that the carious lesion was removed through a form of drilling, much in the manner of modern dental practices. This may have been accomplished through the use of small tools, possibly used in conjunction with an abrasive substance such as sand or with a small stone drill. It is unlikely that a tool was used to pick away at this decay, as no conclusive vertical striae were observed under a focus stacking microscopic examination, scanning electron microscope, or a micro CT scan. However, there are a number of horizontal striae traversing the circumference of the specimen, suggesting the tooth was subjected to a form of repeated circular motion, which is in stark contrast to another carious lesion in the same individual. A negative cross-sectional view of the tooth obtained using specialized micro-CT software demonstrates that the observed striations on the interior of the carious lesion are superficial in nature and not representative of tooth formation processes or internal structure. There is also preliminary evidence of a pre-mortem pulp exposure of the mesiobuccal pulp horn with an approximately 2 millimeter diameter area of dark red-brown stain centered over the pulp exposure, a feature consistent with hemosiderin resulting from a vital pulp exposure. This shows definitively that the processes leading to the unusual carious lesion occurred during the individual's life, as bleeding is evidenced. Further analysis of this specimen and additional investigative methodologies, including hyperspectral microscopy, are ongoing and could greatly add to the growing body of knowledge of the lifeways and health practices of Native American people in the Mid-Atlantic. Now, real quick, for people who aren't dentists, this is the pulp horn right here. And that's where the dark stain was, which you can kind of see right there. And this next slide is a periapical radiograph of the tooth of interest with dentinal sclerosis. You can see the slightly darker area that's right there. It's consistent with a slowly advancing chronic lesion, indicative of therapeutic intervention. Smaller carious lesions in the maxillary right third molar and mandibular left third molar, and carious lesions identified in the dentition of burial 3 and 4, analyzed as control samples, did not show evidence of striations, further supporting how unique the tooth from burial 2 is to our understanding of prehistoric lifeways.
In an effort to gather more data on this discovery, samples from the burials were submitted to the Center for Applied Isotope Studies at the University of Georgia for AMS radiocarbon dating. Before presenting the results of this analysis, it's appropriate to say a few words about how radiocarbon works and sort of how it tells us what it tells us. Carbon dating is based on the fact that all living organisms, both plants and animals, contain carbon, which occurs in 3 forms, or isotopes: carbon-12, carbon-13, and carbon-14. Of these, carbon-14 is the one we're most interested in. C14 is a radioactive isotope created in the Earth's atmosphere by bombardment of nitrogen-14 with cosmic rays. The C14 then bonds with oxygen to become carbon dioxide. Animals breathe in the air containing the carbon dioxide, and plants take it in through the process of photosynthesis. Animals also uptake C14 by eating plants that have incorporated it. Because organisms only take up C14 while they are alive, the amount of C14 present in organic tissue is locked in at the time of death. So the ratio of C14 to C12 in the piece of bone or charcoal that comprises our archaeological sample is the same as in the atmosphere. Now, C14 does not hang around forever. Because it is radioactive and therefore unstable, C14 breaks down over time and reverts back into nitrogen. This decay happens at a known rate called the half-life, which for C14 is about 5,730 years. Because we know the rate at which C14 decays, we can now measure the ratio of stable carbon to radioactive carbon in our sample and do the math to see how long it would have taken for that ratio to be achieved, which dates the death of the organism that our sample came from, be it a plant or an animal. So how do we measure this? The old-fashioned way involved using detectors to count the number of radioactive decay events that occurred over a certain period of time, and using that rate and the size of the sample to calculate the amount of C14 present. While this method is still used, we now generally prefer to use the AMS technique. AMS stands for Accelerator Mass Spectrometry, and essentially involves using a particle accelerator to directly count the number of atoms of each isotope that are present in a sample, rather than calculating it using a decay rate. So what you see in this slide, this is actually the AMS instrument down at University of Georgia that processes our samples. Now, there are a couple of reasons why we like to use the AMS technique rather than conventional radiometric dating. One is that because we're counting atoms directly, we get more precise measurements. With AMS, we can generally date a sample with a plus-minus value of 25 years or less. So basically, we get a 50-year range for the sample's age, as opposed to the 40 to 50-year plus-minus value that's more typical for the traditional radiocarbon technique. Another benefit of the AMS technique is that it requires a very small sample size, which is sometimes all we have to work with. This is of particular importance when the sample in question is human bone. The technique does require destruction of the sample, so when dating human bone, it is preferred to use the smallest sample possible so that we maximize preservation of the remains out of respect for the deceased individual and their descendants. Although both Kerry and Joanna already mentioned it, I will reiterate at this point that we worked closely with the Nansemond tribe during this entire process and had their permission to carry out this destructive sampling. The third reason we like the AMS technique on human bone is that it gives us a little bit of extra data beyond just the age of the sample. The isotopic ratios that we calculate using this method can also give us clues about the deceased individual's diet, which I will touch on in a few minutes. So here we see the raw AMS data and the results of calibrating that data to account for fluctuations in atmospheric C14. Because I've already thrown a lot of science at you, I won't go into a lot of detail about how calibration works, other than to say it involves comparing radiocarbon data to samples of known age. Calibration of the dates yielded a median probability that burial 1 dates to around 1351, that's plus or minus 25 years, and burial 2 to approximately the year 1408, plus or minus 25 years. However, there is another complicating factor when we're dealing with coastal populations who are consuming a lot of marine resources as part of their diet. Because marine creatures process carbon differently than terrestrial organisms, we also have to correct for what we call the marine reservoir effect. Again, I will spare you the sciencey details of how that works. But for these purposes, we assumed a diet consisting of approximately 30% marine resources, and we got the adjusted dates that you see here. Also, as I mentioned earlier, the AMS technique yields data on stable isotope concentrations, which can be used to infer information about diet. The delta 13C concentration of the samples, which makes use of another stable carbon isotope, indicates consumption of plants utilizing both the C3 and C4 photosynthetic pathways, indicating that maize, which is a C4 plant, constituted a significant percentage of the diet. Now, this is not unexpected for the time period. We know that late woodland populations in this region were consuming maize. But in the absence of direct evidence for maize cultivation on this site, this is nonetheless significant data on how these individuals lived. The stable isotope data suggest a varied diet, which included maize and marine resources, and this is significant for what it tells us about settlement patterns. Maize horticulture, of course, requires people to be settled in a single location for an entire growing season. So we know we're looking at folks who are living in villages rather than pursuing a more nomadic lifestyle. As part of our continued research on this project, we hope to obtain additional information about dietary practices by analyzing the dental calculus extracted from the burials. The formation of calculus, or hardened dental plaque, can inadvertently trap oral microbiota, environmental debris, and food remains in a stable anaerobic environment that's conducive to preservation. When properly tested, this otherwise sort of gross material can offer much detailed information on the diet, health, and living conditions of the individuals from which it is recovered. Additionally, it is hoped that residues recovered from the interior of the altered carious lesion may indicate whether it was filled or packed with some material. A Neolithic era tooth discovered in Pakistan, for example, was found to have been packed with beeswax, a reliable antimicrobial packing material, after having been subjected to dental intervention. A final avenue for additional research will involve attempts at experimental replication of the striations observed within the enlarged carious lesion to determine the methods used to extract the decayed tissue. Similar experiments have been conducted by anthropologists in Colorado, Alaska, Italy, Pakistan, and Peru, where evidence of dental intervention has been discovered, where both bone and stone tools were utilized to extract or scrape away the decayed tissue. To meet this goal, we will drill several teeth with a variety of stone tools that we have had specially made. We plan to use a variety of materials such as quartz, quartzite, and chert to see how the material type alters the interior of the tooth. These are all materials, by the way, that would have been locally available to the people living at this site. Once we have a large enough sample of drilled teeth, we will then examine them through the micro CT scanning process, just like we did the archaeological sample, so that we can accurately compare the markings or striations on the interior of the tooth. This process will likely take some time, especially with limited access to laboratories. However, we plan to continue our studies as soon as possible with the goal of eventually publishing these findings.
And one thing we'd really like to impress upon everyone is the extraordinary significance of this find. And to do that, we'd like to introduce you to a young man named Richard Mutton, who was approximately 15 or 16 years old when he landed at Jamestown Colony in 1607. Richard arrived at Jamestown with a raging infection in his lower jaw, probably the result of a broken tooth. As you can see from the image on the left, the infection actually ate away the bone, leaving a gaping hole. This would have caused tremendous pain and disfigurement and would also have compromised his immune system and weakened his body. Richard died a few months after his arrival, and although archaeologists found an arrow point in his left thigh, the wound would probably have been survivable. The real cause of death was likely the infection that destroyed his jaw. So Richard, a white boy from a nation that considered itself far superior to the indigenous peoples of North America, died of an infected tooth. Yet before anyone from Europe arrived at Jamestown, a middle-aged American Indian man living in a settlement near Hampton, Virginia, was being successfully treated for the same thing. A member of his community drilled his tooth, removing the infected material and saving him from escalating pain, decreased health, and possibly death. Although it might not be what we think of today as dentistry with its x-rays and anesthesia and specialized tools, this was a sophisticated medical procedure. Coupled with the fact that a second molar was extracted, it indicates a solid understanding of the effects of disease and infection on an individual's health, as well as an established healing practice. If Richard Mutton is any indication, that just wasn't happening in England, in spite of the colonists' conviction of their own superiority. Oh, it makes you wonder what life-saving skills the Jamestown colonists might have learned had they viewed the indigenous tribes as partners in survival rather than as curious.
Oh, did we lose Joanna?
looks like. Let's wait a few more seconds.
Okay.
Do any of you happen to have the script?
I've got the wrap up paragraph. So I'll finish this up, and if she had more to say on what she was specifically talking about, she can do that during the Q&A. So in conclusion, and as usual, the data obtained through these investigations create as many questions as they answer, which is of course the whole point to science. So definitives aren't necessarily appropriate here. However, we can draw at least 4 conclusions from our research thus far. 1, this is a tantalizing discovery that begs for additional study, including re-examination of carious lesions and other dental pathologies from previously excavated burials. 2nd, this research offered a chance to develop a collegial, respectful, and productive relationship with an Indigenous community. 3rd, this project brought together a highly diverse group of professionals who likely never have otherwise been in contact, and showcased the types of data that can be drawn from such cross-disciplinary efforts. Finally, none of this would have happened if it hadn't been for a simple observation of, hey, that lesion looks weird. Let's give it another look. Sometimes pursuit of such simple hunches can have startling results. And that's it.
All right. Thank you so much. If Joanne comes back, we'll ask her to summarize her section. So why don't we ask our participants to write their questions in the Q&A box on their screens. And while we're waiting for that, I was thinking as you were presenting, can you refer to, I understand this is a unique project. Can you refer to comparable projects that give you a sort of a context for how to pursue this kind of findings?
Comparable projects?
Comparable projects, yes. In terms of, and you talked about, Joanne mentioned the one at Jamestown, the young man with that infection. So in terms of understanding dental practices going back at that time, are there any comparable researches or findings?
Well, like we mentioned, there's the one in Colorado and Alaska where they have evidence of drilled teeth. They actually, I think it's Colorado where they have the incisor drilled. Is that right, Joe? I think
Yes.
It was one of the front teeth. Those and the ones from Pakistan, they had an entire, like 13 people in a cemetery that had drilled teeth. So we have been leaning on those studies.
And the techniques are comparable from what you can say? The techniques, does the tooth have the same look?
Some of them do, yes. There's been a couple that they had more markings going down the tooth, the vertical ones instead of circular, but there's ones that had the circumferential striations as well.
So this is really a sort of a cutting edge kind of discovery, at least here in this part on the East Coast, right?
As far as we can tell, this is the first evidence of it on the East Coast. Not that it's not there, but it's the first that's been noticed.
All right.
And that's a great point that Kerry just made is, this is the first time we've seen this, but it can't possibly be unique. So as I think Kerry already mentioned, part of what we hope will come of this research is that people will start sort of paying attention to this. And, when they get these burials from this time period, actually start actively looking for carious lesions that have had dental intervention.
Now we have
We're sure there are more examples.
We have quite a number of questions in our Q&A box. Can one of you please look them up?
Yeah. Okay. I'm gonna It says, do you know whether this early dental work was considered a special skill or was it seen as a tool in the first aid kit of Native Virginians? I don't know the answer to that. You know, we know so little about it in this region right now. Joe, do you have a different answer?
Not really, but my guess is that everybody's not doing this. My guess is that this is, you know, being done by a practitioner, or a person within the village or the settlement that had this knowledge and had done it before. But you know, with only the single example, it's very difficult to tell.
Next question. Do you know what the significance of the fetal position was in the burials?
Not at all.
Oh, Joanna, you're back.
I have no
But
idea what happened. I apologize, everyone. My system froze up and I had to log in from another computer. That's, it's characteristic of prehistoric burials up to a certain point in time and the very late prehistoric. But what the significance is, I'm not aware of that.
Okay, thank you. Next, how long was this process of finding this and understanding the information found? The excavation took place in May of 2018, and we're still working on it. You know, we still have a lot to do. We had the question about the dental intervention pretty early on, but we got, it was this real roller coaster ride of one dentist would be like, yeah, that's what it looks like. And then someone else would look at the picture and be like, no, that's normal. So it was just this chaotic kind of, yes, it's that. No, it's not. Yes, it is. No, it's not. And then we kept going down that road. And finally, after the images and the Archaeologist from was it at UPenn, he was kind of the nail in the coffin, and he was like, yes, this is it. And that was pretty amazing to get that. Joanna, I think this one's going to be for you. It says, could you talk a bit more about how the Nansemond tribe has reacted to this project? Do they want to pursue more research?
The tribe, and specifically the tribal council, have been extraordinarily supportive. They were very excited when we first informed them of our preliminary findings. And I think that there's a sense that these individuals have the ability to tell the tribe a little bit more about where they came from and the lives of their ancestors. And they have remained excited and remained supportive throughout this process. Of course, COVID has derailed just about everything for everybody. So it's been a little while since we had a group discussion about where to go from here. But I have no doubt that when additional research is proposed, we will continue to find support from the descendant community.
Thank you, Joanna. Was there evidence of therapeutics used on the tooth, such as from residue analysis? We looked at this under, oh my gosh, I'm forgetting. Joe, help. What? I'm blanking on, we put this thing under so many microscopes. What the, I can't remember the name of it, but we have looked for residue on this. There's one machine that we still need to look at.
We used Raman.
Yes.
We used the Raman spectroscopy.
Yes. We didn't get anything from that. And it may just be it's worn away, but we are still pursuing trying to find out if it was packed with anything. It almost had to have been. It would have been so painful to have that giant hole in your mouth. But we're trying to figure out what it would have been packed with, because beeswax isn't an option for this because the bee wasn't here in Virginia yet. So, Joe, you've been thinking of like a tar.
Yeah, like a pine or a birch resin, some sort of tree-based resin may have been effective. All of the dental experts that we spoke to, though, kind of indicated that it almost certainly, as Kerry said, would have had to been packed with something, because with that exposed pulp horn, that's where the nerve endings come into the tooth. And this just, if it wasn't packed with something, every time this individual chewed, on this tooth, it would have been incredibly painful.
So we've been thinking of some kind of sticky substance, like Joe mentioned, maybe even with like a willow bark or something mixed in. And we were hoping that maybe if we were ever got a chance to get the calculus looked at, that there might be traces in that. But with COVID and other things, a lot of that analysis has been paused for the time being. Next
And
question.
we're thinking a little
bit
about willow bark.
What's that?
Oh, I just wanted to mention we're thinking about willow bark a little bit, because willow bark contains a natural form of salicylic acid, which we all know as aspirin, and it was known to Native Americans. So they may have been attempting to use some sort of painkiller here.
You'd almost think they'd have to. Is there any evidence of a tool they might have used for the dentist work that they did? Joe, you want to take a stab at this one?
We have some thoughts. We don't really know for sure, that's going to be the point of the experimental archaeology, is we're going to try a couple of different tools. They could have been using these stone drills like we showed the image of. They could have been using a tool made out of shell or bone. They're removing diseased and decayed tissue. So the material that they have to get out of this carious lesion is not as hard as the rest of the tooth. It's going to be a little soft and pulpy because it's decayed. So they may have been using something made of stone. It may have been, bone, as I said, or shell. This is a coastal population. There's shells everywhere. There were some limiting factors. This is being done on a living person who can only open their mouth so wide. So that's another issue, is, you have to find a tool that you can actually get in there and get access at the right angle. It's also possible they could have been using something like just a very thin reed and filling this carious lesion with some particles of sand or some other abrasive, and just basically using a thin reed or a straw to sort of rotate that sand around in there and scrape things out. But again, these are the kinds of questions that we need to turn to the experimental work in order to really definitively answer.
I'm going to read this next one, even though I feel like we've already answered it. It says, I imagine that the procedure like this would have been quite painful. Since the advanced technique suggests that there may have been a long history of dental intervention in this culture, I'm wondering if there's any evidence that the pain easing substances may have been involved as well. And like we said, Joe said, quite possibly, and we're hoping to get some evidence of that, but we don't have any right now. You mentioned one of the wisdom teeth was removed. Were tooth extractions common? Joanna?
I'll take this one. Yeah, I think that's a great question. And frankly, we really haven't been looking at prehistoric populations with mechanical extraction in mind. You do see many instances of teeth being missing well before a person dies, because you'll see evidence in the bone that would have held the tooth remodeling itself, growing back together again, healing after the tooth is lost. But that can be just as possible if a tooth is lost due to attrition. It falls out because it's diseased. It's knocked out traumatically if someone is hit by something, something like that. So if anything, this research, I think, has prompted those of us involved, and hopefully everyone that we've talked to about it, to look a bit more critically at dentition when we have the opportunity to see it, and consider that it might reflect purposeful intervention rather than just a natural form of attrition.
And I will say, after we've first presented this, a colleague working in Maryland has what she believes is dental intervention on some late woodland remains as well. I believe that she's still doing the analysis, but she went back to look at them and she remembered hearing something. And so it's, you know, some of these remains just might need to be looked at again. Is there any evidence archaeologically or archivally that the Native Americans in the area might have offered to treat the colonists at Jamestown using their own medical techniques? I don't think so. Joanna or Joe?
I'm not aware of any.
No, not to my knowledge.
Well, that's the last of them. That's the last question.
I find this a really fascinating subject, and as you were providing these last answers, I was thinking about the image of the tooth. Can you bring it up? It's the one we have on our poster, Kerry.
Mm-hmm.
Those are so regular and so evenly distributed on the height of the tooth. And when you think that they use hand power tools or whatever, something to do that, it's just a remarkable engineering work, if nothing else. Yeah, this one, the bottom one.
Mm-hmm.
So the lines, you know, the grooves have the same width, and is I don't know.
Especially when you look at it in comparison to this one, that's just so smooth.
Right.
And, you know, you were asking about comparative. Let me go back through. So this is, I believe this is the one from Colorado. This was an incisor that was drilled. And you can see the marks on that one. That one would have been easier to drill, being in the front of the mouth, easier access. But that it is certainly going to be a challenge for us to get in the back, you know, to drill it and replicate the access.
Can you have you made plans for how you'll be conducting the experimental archaeology tests, or?
Yes.
Yeah.
Through some contacts, physical anthropologists that teach physical anthropology, they use actual cadavers in their classes, and we have been offered access to those to drill the teeth of people that have donated their bodies to science.
Mm-hmm. And you'll have your own set of tools that you think that might have been the ones used in?
Yeah, these were actually made for us by a friend of a friend in Texas. Just, we're going to try them out and see if they work. We've got a set made of quartz and quartzite, also not pictured here, but just going to try a bunch of different things and see how it works. And, you know, this is, we don't know what it looked like, but these could work. They might not work at all. But you have to start somewhere, right?
These are so tiny. I mean, the grip on such a tiny tool is going to be difficult. I mean, that's how I see it.
But it needs to be small to get way in the back of the mouth and have kind of the place for your fingers to be able to turn and turn and turn.
Yeah, that raises lots of questions on who's going to do that work and
who's going to hold still for it.
Yeah. We're going to use Joe's dog.
I'm surprised our students are not asking those questions. All right, so I don't see any other questions. I think we'll be wrapping up here. We thank you. We're really honored that you decided to share your early stages of your project with our department here at Mary Washington. Dovetail is a very close partner of our department. Former students work there, and I know some are in the audience tonight. So we are very grateful for your generosity, and we hope to have you back at some point in the future when you'll have more findings to share with us. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.